All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Wendy Wilbur, Statewide Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator, and we are going to go ahead and get started pretty soon. We got a nice crowd coming in, getting close to about 200 people, so that's fun. I'm going to go ahead and click. And if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat box where you're joining in from, and since we might be talking about garden tools today, I want to know, how old is your oldest gardening tool? And so welcome from Alachua and Volusia County, Brevard County, Pinellas County says 20 years, Tampa, Lee County, Monroe, Osceola, Polk. Oh, someone has a tool that's over 50 years old, or circa 1950, so that's 70 years old. Pinellas County, Sarasota, Martin, Seminole, someone says 25 years plus. St. Johns County, Palm Beach, Sarasota, Clay. Someone's here from Key West, so all the way down south. Hillsboro, 40 years for hers. Monica says 17 for hers, and from Duval. Seminole County, someone's got one from the 1950s. Alachua, Palm Beach, Duval. I hope I said that right. Okay, Sumter County. So there's folks from all over jumping in, from many places. And Jessica, as we in the summer months, Master Gardeners join in from all over the state, but definitely they'll say, "Oh, I'm in Europe," or "I'm in Alaska," or "I'm in Indiana." So it's always fun to see where people are. Yep, someone's from Anchorage, Alaska today. Yeah, I knew it. Titusville, Pinellas, Manatee, Palm Beach. Some people really love their tools, over 40 years old, over 50. Oh, and someone has their grandmother's watering can.
Don't make them like they used to.
Oh, that's for sure, isn't it? Clay County. All right, good group of folks. Oh, someone's got a wooden garden bench from the 20s. Oh, I'm jealous. Shovel, at least 20 years old. Okay, someone's now in Brazil because it's vacation. How fun. Indian
Yep.
River County's here, Broward. All right, welcome everybody. We're about 275 folks strong, and we're glad that you're here. And we have, of course, wonderful webinars. Today is adaptive gardening strategies. Next month is gardening and artificial intelligence, how to spot a fake and catch a thief. So that's going to be a fun webinar coming up. Reminder that we do have the Master Gardener Volunteer Leadership School at the end of the month, July 28th and 29th. It's going to be held in Ocala at the Marion County Extension Office. So we'd love for you to come if you're identified as your coordinator, as someone who can come. So check in with your agent if you would like to. And we do have our book club going on right now. We're on chapter 4, but if you still want to buy the book Garden for Life by Rhonda Fleming Hayes, we would encourage you to do that. Our discussion with the author will be August 14th. It's a Friday at 2 p.m. Okay. Tonight is our info session for our Costa Rica study tour that we're doing, March of 2027. So that's at 6:30 tonight. We have a lot of people signed up for that and not a lot of spots. So it's going to be a small group. We're going to learn about biodiversity, sustainable landscapes, and food production down there. And I do want to let you know that we do have our International Master Gardener Conference scheduled for May 2nd through 6th, 2027. We will be at the Caribe Royale in Orlando, Florida, and hopefully there will be hundreds of master gardeners from all across the United States coming to join us, and we're going to really show off how awesome Florida is and how awesome our horticulture is. So we're looking forward to that. Okay, so for today, after our chat is closed down at the beginning, we are going to limit our questions to the question answer box. So use the Q&A box. And if it's for a point of clarity, I'll stop Jessica and then we'll get it clarified. But if it's a comment or a question that would be better for the end, we'll handle all of those at the end of the talk. So I'm really excited today. We have Jessica Sullivan. She is a Sustainable Agriculture Extension Agent in Osceola County. She has in the past been a Florida Friendly Landscaping Agent. She's done ton of work in commercial horticulture and with small farmers. And she is trained in horticulture therapy and adaptive gardening practices. And if you have never heard Jessica talk before on this subject, she's just marvelous. And it's such a treat to have you. Welcome, Jessica. The Master
Thank
Gardeners are
you.
thrilled to have you here today. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to share and get going. Okay. Did I do it? Did I stop share? Yes. Okay, good.
Tell me what you see.
All right. We see it perfectly. Good job.
Okay, excellent. Well, for the moment you see my face, I wanted to tell everyone hello out there and thank you for joining me. This is one of the subject areas that I'm really passionate about because I believe that everybody can benefit from gardening, and it's just a matter of knowing how to participate and how to adapt your garden and your lifestyle and your tools to fit your needs. I am going to turn off my camera. I'm sorry about that, but I've had some unstable internet connection today, so I need to try to hang on and stay with you today. Bear with me. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today are some tips for designing and adapting your landscapes and gardens to reduce maintenance and make life easier for you. And also, we're going to feature some tools and techniques to prevent pain and injury, because nobody should be getting hurt. So why adapt your landscape or garden? Well, because gardening can be kind of hard on us. There are a lot of movements and activities that we do, like lifting and bending and kneeling and twisting and doing jarring movements to our bodies that can result in pain and injury, and that makes gardening a lot less fun. So if you were to Google things like common garden injuries, some of these and a whole lot more will come up. And unfortunately, the master gardeners that I work with, we've seen repeats of all of these over the years. And that breaks my heart because, nobody should have to, it shouldn't have to be a trial and a pain to garden. And then after you get hurt, it makes you afraid to garden or unable to garden. So what we want to do is avoid these things. And adaptive gardening is called that for a reason, because every single gardener has different gardening goals and different gardening activities that they participate in, and they have different physical abilities. And so your gardening style and your gardening tools need to be individualized to meet your needs. So I'd like to go over a few tips, kind of focusing on gardens and landscapes on a slightly larger scale. But I do first want to acknowledge and full understanding here that gardening can happen at any level and any scale, whether it's your windowsill or your patio. And a lot of us, the most enjoyable gardening we have is on a smaller scale because we can really specialize and grow those cool plants that we love. So the next few tips are actually going to look at adapting a larger scale, landscape or larger scale area for a moment though. So let's just acknowledge some realities of having an actual landscape that is planted in the ground. Every single landscape has its set of problems. A lot of that is a result of having the wrong plant in the wrong place, and you all are very familiar with this concept. And so adapting the landscape may require significant labor or significant funds if we were to completely do that. So kind of, what I would like you to frame, your future thoughts and ideas and goals around is focusing maybe on a small area if it's not feasible to adapt your entire, lawn or landscape area, And also, kind of focusing in on removal of plants that are already causing you problems, both now and maybe in the future. So I threw a photo of the lovely bougainvillea in here. And as many of you know, it starts out wonderful and beautiful, always a great, low care plant. And then it starts to take over your life and try to poke out your eyes and scratch your car and, creep into areas where you don't want it. So really thinking through, what is going to be the right plant for this place and not planting things that are going to cause issues for maintenance and potential injury later. And then targeting the removal of things that are already in the landscape and may be an ongoing maintenance nightmare for us. And the reality is, I'm not going to tell any tales about how, you can create an easy breezy, low maintenance landscape, because the reality is, if you have trees and shrubs and lawn, that is going to require some work. And things like pruning and mulching, and some of that can be more intense labor, and not all of that is possible to do for each and every one of us. Sometimes sizing equipment appropriately and using the right tools can help, but we also need to acknowledge when maybe it's time to hire that out, or maybe we don't have that very high maintenance hedge in the landscape anymore. So one tip that I have found helpful in my own yard, when I talk to master gardeners and homeowners, the number one task that they always tell me causes them issues and aggravation for a lifetime is weeds in plant beds. And so here are a couple of tips to hopefully reduce weeds in plant beds, so we don't have to pull weeds as much and as often. And again, let's acknowledge the reality that, like, if you have a plant bed, it's going to grow weeds in it at some point in time. It's just impossible to completely keep all of the weeds out, and that is going to take some ongoing maintenance. But I did want to kind of point out a few things. So in picture number one, we have a great landscape, but there's no edging around that plant bed. So mulch is going to be displaced and washed away and tumble out into the lawn. And also the lawn and weeds from the lawn are going to creep a little bit easier into those plant beds. And so, there's nothing wrong with this really. It's just that it might be a little more maintenance without having any actual borders around it. Also, if there are no borders around plants, if you are not the one personally taking care of your landscape and using the lawn equipment and the weed eaters and the edgers, then there's a pretty good chance at some point a landscape professional is going to creep up into the plant beds. And in this example in photo one, things are placed pretty appropriately, but in some cases, the edges of the beds are pretty small, and a weed eater or a mower can easily harm a tree. And once injury is done to a tree, mechanical injury like that, it's a lifelong injury and they're not going to recover from it. So having appropriately placed edges around the beds can also protect your valuable landscape palms and trees. So in photo number two, there is an edge around there, which might make it a little easier to use, an edger around there, but it's also going to be a little difficult on those pretty intense curves to get some lawn equipment in and out of there, depending on what type of lawn equipment you have. So, in picture three, we're getting a little bit closer to something that might be a little bit easier to maintain. You have slightly curved edges where a mower could usually make its way around, a weed eater, edger, and yet, the plants are contained in the bed. You've got lawn areas separately. So that might be one tip that could help a little bit in keeping weeds out of the beds and keeping the lawn in place. You also want to plant things with the end goal of having complete coverage in your landscape beds. Mulch and rock in a landscape bed should not be considered an actual landscape feature, in my opinion, because neither one is going to prevent weeds completely. It will suppress weeds for a short time, but sooner or later, the weeds are going to find their way in. And so the thing that is going to really limit weeds is having plants that are growing that are bigger than the weeds that hopefully will take over that area instead of the weeds. So really, look at how you can limit the amount of open space that you have in your plant beds. And so my suggestion for when you're planting things that are small now but are going to be bigger later is plant smaller ground covers and, like smaller bedding plants and things like that for a temporary amount of time so that they can cover that area over until some of those larger trees or shrubs start to shade out and cover over the landscape bed area. And this one's kind of, it's not a fail-safe way of doing things, but sometimes perennial plants can be a little bit less maintenance in a landscape bed than constantly having to change out your landscape annuals. Landscape annuals are great like in containers, but in the ground, they're higher maintenance in that like you're constantly having to change them out. And so sometimes having perennials can reduce a little bit of that maintenance. But I will not pretend like you're never going to have to deadhead or weed in a perennial bed because you probably will. And here's the bigger concept I really want to introduce to you today in making an actual landscape lower maintenance is the traditional landscapes that we think of with having a lawn and lots of plant beds and trees might not ever be very low maintenance. What might be a little bit more low maintenance would be having a lot of hardscaping and a few key trees in the right places for shade. And then having the rest of the landscape be pretty much made up of raised beds and containers that can enhance and add the pretty elements and the more practical elements and the changeable elements of the landscape rather than having lots of rows of hedged shrubs or lots of plant beds that we're having to get down on the ground and plant directly in or prune or weed and have to do all of that maintenance inside of the plant beds. And so having smaller, more contained raised beds and containers of a variety of different sizes and placement might be the closest we're going to get to a low maintenance landscape. And so here's one example where, you have some trees over in the background, but the majority of this space is made up of raised beds and containers and hardscaping. And so there's going to be less weeding. Everything is, at waist level, so you don't have to bend down on the ground and do it. So, this might be an example of something that's a little bit lower maintenance to take care of. And vegetable gardens are always fun, and those should, in my opinion, only ever be done in containers and raised beds. And so there are a lot of variations on this. The goal is to get your garden off of the ground because, the weed pressure of trying to grow vegetables in the ground is just not realistic for most of us. And so having, bagged soil that is starting weed free and putting that into a raised bed is probably your best bet for growing vegetables here in Florida. If you're from other places, you've probably experienced vegetable garden growing in the ground. And let me just tell you, Florida is a different place if you haven't experienced that already. And there are some things that just don't really makes sense to do, like growing vegetables in the ground in Florida. So again, like we have lots of options that are, prefabricated things that you can just put together in kits that make this very, very easy. A few tips for raised beds. I would highly recommend using something like composite lumber or PVC or other weather resistant material, and not use anything made out of wood, even if it's, a cedar or something that's supposed to be more weather resistant. I don't recommend using treated lumber. Forget about the landscape timbers. All of that stuff is going to degrade very, very quickly. And, you can end up with termites and rotted wood in a season or two at most. And it also helps if you cover the ground underneath a raised bed or have it on a hard surface so that you don't have, weeds creeping, so you're not accidentally mowing and blowing things into your raised bed. A few other tips is don't ever create a raised bed that's going to be more than 3 or 4 feet wide, because you need to be able to access it on all sides without having to reach, and definitely without having to stand inside of the beds, because that would just completely delete any benefit of having a raised bed. Raised beds usually should be at least 2 feet tall. This is going to save our backs, and it's also going to get it up off the ground to reduce some of the weeds that can creep and find their way into raised beds. And have a stable surface around your raised bed, and this can be made of a lot of different ground coverings, but have something that's not slick. I've seen people try to use, things like the landscape, like the nursery fabric and things like that. And it becomes very slippery very easily as soon as it gets wet. So, do be careful about what surfaces you're picking. Gravel can be very unstable, and, paving stones may have, spaces between them that make it unstable. So, try to make the areas around your bed very stable, because you don't want to have to focus on, finding your footing and gardening inside of your bed. And we already talked about wood is not an ideal material. And also, although sometimes when you start looking or Googling, ergonomic gardens or stand-up gardens or something like that, they'll feature designs that, you're supposed to sit on the edge and garden. And that does not actually do your body any favors, because you're having to twist and reach your garden if that's the case. So not sitting on bed edges is a best practice. And so try to create something where you can either stand or sit and make it easier on your back, not sit on the edge and twist around. Also, you don't ever want to build a raised bed onto a structure, because this increases your termite potential, and you can't inspect the structure appropriately, and it can cause a lot of moisture around the base of your structure. And here are just a few more examples. And so really, things can be mobile to where you could move them around a patio area, or they can be more permanent. They could be affixed to, the landscape itself, or concrete, or it can just be something that you put onto a surface. And if you have animals nearby, here are a couple of ideas for keeping, both pets, feral cats, deer away from a garden, and actually having, a small fenced in area, which in some cases is absolutely necessary if you're going to try to grow vegetables. And here are just some ideas for tools to use in raised beds. So the type of tool that you use in a raised bed is going to depend on the bed height and how wide the bed is and the type of gardening task that you're going to do. But luckily now most garden centers sell tools that are specifically designed for raised beds. And so sometimes you can just, if it's at waist height, you're just using small handheld tools. I feature here in this photo on the left a hori hori knife. This is one of my favorite gardening tools because you can use it like a trowel without having to twist your wrist. And so you just hang on to that and use it kind of like a dagger, and you can actually dig with it. You can, cut through some roots with it. It's a very adaptable tool that is easier on your wrist to use. And I featured a couple of other unique designs, like the 5-tine T-grip raised bed cultivator that has a slightly longer handle on it, but is still short enough to use in a raised bed. And I'd like to go over a few tips for container gardening. And, here are just a few photos, and there are so many amazing ideas, that are at the click of a mouse now that you can get for using containers in the landscape. And here are just a few ideas. And you can see from this, it gives the effect of a landscape without having the high maintenance of having landscape beds that you constantly have to weed in. A few tips for container gardening: be sure that whatever you're growing, the roots have enough space. So for example, if you are trying to do like miniature fruit plants in containers, they do need quite a bit of space to actually grow and produce and be healthy. And so you can't, stack them into a tiny little pot forever and ever and expect them to grow well or produce things. Drainage is critical for any kind of container that you're growing in. Most all plants need some sort of drainage, and using pot saucers can have some mixed results. Most people use them to protect their patio surfaces, but they also tend to collect a lot of water. So if that's the case, it can actually cause rot and mosquitoes and things like that. So kind of think about how you can strategize and place things in an area where you don't have to use the saucers. And the potting mix that you use for containers is just going to depend on whether the pot itself is heavy enough to stabilize the plant, and the type of plant and soil and moisture conditions that are needed by a particular species. And just a few more examples of types of containers that you can use. And a lot of these have like watering at the bottom of the container, which can make it a little bit easier because you have a reserve there and you're not constantly having to irrigate. And we'll talk about irrigation of containers in a moment. So one of the most important things you can do for yourself, and this is every age of gardener, this has nothing to do with whether you have physical limitations or not, you better be using the right tools for the job, because this is going to save your plants and it's going to save your body. So here are different types of digging and dirt moving tools that are available, and I see people frequently misusing these and using them all interchangeably. So we'll just kind of talk from left to right what these various tools would be used for. So a mulch fork is great for moving mulch. You shouldn't have to use a shovel, which is very difficult and cumbersome. So when you're having to move mulch, a mulch fork works great. A gardening fork, on the other hand, is going to be terrible for moving mulch. It is used for things like mixing in amendments or mixing in compost. A potato fork is next, and those are specifically for digging up your root vegetables, and they are specifically designed for that. A square shovel is used for moving gravel. It really is not used for digging. It will be very difficult if you try to dig with a square shovel. One of my favorite tools to have around is a trenching shovel. You can use it for all kinds of things. It's lighter weight and you can dig a little bit easier without, having to have your really big, heavy shovel. And then having a lightweight digging spade is going to be important for anybody that has an actual landscape. And so you would use that for things like planting shrubs or, if you actually had to dig a hole for something. And a pointed digging spade is nice to have if you have areas that, you have plant roots in, but I will give a word of warning, if you're doing too much digging under a tree, you can actually damage the roots of the tree and harm the tree. So, think about what your priorities are and whether you need to be planting something in an area that has a lot of roots in it. But these are just a few examples of digging tools and how to properly use them. So hoeing can be a very backbreaking task. And again, I hope that none of you ever have to utilize a hoe in your gardens because these are typically old school tools that people would use in a vegetable garden and occasionally in a shrub bed for weeding and making rows. And, it is my recommendation that you never garden in the ground with vegetables. And so things like on the left where you have a traditional chopping hoe or a large grubbing hoe, those are good if you're doing 100 years ago farm labor out in the fields. But for most of us now, you should not be utilizing these very often for very many tasks because they're really hard on your body. When you have to make a chopping motion and pull it, that's not something that is going to be easy on your body. It's very jarring. If you do utilize hoes in your plant beds for light weeding, that's all they should be used for. If you have heavy weed infestations, they're not going to be very effective, but you should be using circular types of hose and scuffle hose, collinear hose, things that you can simply move back and forth and push and pull without having to chop. And then there's almost no way to avoid pruning unless you're just doing very light gardening or, a little bit of, small scale vegetable gardening. So if you have any trees and shrubs, you're probably going to be doing some pruning at some point in time. So it's really important that you have the right tool for the size and type of branch that you're cutting. So hand pruners like the one shown here really shouldn't be used for anything bigger than about a 1/2-inch diameter branches. And I know some of you are violating this protocol. And if you're trying to chop larger branches with hand tools, it's just going to be difficult. You're not going to get a clean cut on it. And getting a good clean cut is really important for preserving trees and shrubs and preventing injury. And so a few features that I like on hand pruners, the Fiskars shown here, you can't see it in a PowerPoint, but these actually have a rotating handle. Those are the Power Gear hand pruners. There are other types of other brands that also carry rotating handles, but I am really fond of the Fiskars because they're very lightweight and easy to use, and it reduces the tension that you have to use when you are hand pruning. And another thing that is now readily available only in recent years are battery powered hand pruners. And there are many different styles and brands available out there. The one shown here is the Works Nitro battery powered pruner. And all you do is push a little trigger button and it does the pruning for you. So that reduces a lot of the actual labor. So if you have, difficulty with maintaining a grip and being able to do repetitive pruning, then please look into getting a pair of battery powered pruners. I got some for my mom a year ago and she loves them. And so loppers are kind of the next step up in pruning. And these would be for branches, that are typically over a ½ inch in diameter, but really not any larger than about an inch in diameter. Or again, it's just not going to do the job well. It's not going to give you a clean cut. So this is for, pruning very small tree branches or larger shrubs. And some helpful features to have for loppers would be a ratcheting action, which it reduces the amount of actual pressure that you have to put on the tool. So you don't have to have the same amount of strength because the tool is doing it for you. And in recent times, there are newer models that have branch grip jaws. So that helps you hang on to the branch. And that's the example that is shown on the far right there. And then this is kind of the step below a chainsaw, right? So there are the mechanical saws that you use by hand. And the ones that you buy at Home Depot, for example, the big box stores, they don't stock the arborist grade tools. And so I highly recommend, if you're doing any cutting of any branches over, about 2 inches thick, that you use an arborist grade tool. And you won't even believe the difference between, your run-of-the-mill hand saw versus an arborist grade tool. They cut like silk. It makes it very easy. And then a step up from that would be using a reciprocating saw with appropriate pruning blades. And so, many of you are familiar with, they generically call the branded ones Sawzall, but these are reciprocating saws. And now a lot of the arborists actually use these for the majority of their pruning because it's easier to be much more precise with a reciprocating saw versus a chainsaw. And it's not nearly as dangerous and it's not nearly as heavy as a chainsaw. So you can actually cut through some, sizable branches pretty easily when you have the right type of pruning blade on it. And you'll notice I don't even talk about chainsaws, mind you, because most of us should not have chainsaws in our hand. They're very dangerous. A lot of people just refuse to wear the appropriate gear for them. They're not trained in using them. And then when you throw in things like ladders and bucket trucks, those are not things that untrained, homeowners should really even be messing with. So some other helpful gardening gadgets and aids would be tools that have arm support. So shown in the picture on the left are the PETA Easy Grip handles that can be adapted. These are nice when you only have use of one arm, and then you can still utilize it with that adaptive grip on there. And things like a faucet handle that gives you more leverage, things like that are available at places like Gardening with Ease. So I just wanted to mention, I'm going to send out a list of all of the tools that I feature in here. So don't worry about trying to write down every single one. You'll get a copy of the PowerPoint that will be posted with the video. So you can always refer back to that later. And using adaptive handles and adaptive grip aids. And so this contraption on the far right there is actually a garden grip aid where you fit that over a garden glove and it allows you to grip even if you cannot, if you don't have the grip strength to do it yourself. It gives you the ability to grasp onto a garden tool. And here's one anybody can make very easily. It's just a PVC pipe with a kitchen funnel at the top, and that would be, a stand-up garden cedar. But again, I would really like to encourage people to garden at waist level or sit down and garden and not have to do this, at the ground level at all. There are also seeding tools that make these very fine motor skills working with very tiny seeds a little bit easier. So there are all kinds of seed dispensers, like a couple of the models shown here, and using something like a wax tip pencil to grasp those little tiny seeds and then plant them. This would be for like when you're doing things like in a transplant tray and you're seeding very tiny seeds. This can make it easier to do that. And there are even things like seeding templates that's shown like on the far right there, where you put the seeds into the holes. And these are helpful for any of us because, I have a hard time seeing where I have planted seeds, and then I'm double or triple planting them. And so just having a seeding template can make it a lot easier to do. And these are also great adaptive aids for people with lower vision. And if you do have to work at ground level, using something like a garden kneeler can be helpful in some cases, or a garden seat or garden chair. This one is on wheels on the right there, and it gives you a stable place to sit and kind of scoot along as you're working your way, around a landscape bed, for example. But again, it has to be the right tool, the right aid for the person and the person's comfort level and physical needs. Irrigating with a hose can be very, very laborious and actually very dangerous, having to tug on the hose and potentially trip over the hose, and that is not ideal. And so having automated watering systems is a great way to reduce dead plants. It's a great way to reduce dead plants and also labor and having to be on site at the right time all of the time. So using things like micro irrigation systems in your garden containers can keep those containers alive. And if it's on a timer, then it takes a lot of pressure off you to have to, drag a hose around or a water can, heaven forbid, and water like that in a more intensive fashion. Using things like tree bags to get trees established can be helpful if you're working with plants that, are drought tolerant once they are established. And using in, say patio areas, things like the coiling hoses or expanding hoses, like is shown on the right side there in those two photos, can really save some trip hazards and make it easier to store things. So kind of getting away from some of those traditional, old school heavy hoses that you lug around and just, trip on, to be quite honest. Now let's talk about the movements and techniques that we use in the garden. So one of the first things you can do for yourself is just adapt good habits out in the garden. And there tends to be, I think, a certain level of obsessiveness and compulsiveness in a lot of us gardeners, and we like to complete tasks, and sometimes this is to our danger and detriment. And so setting a timer to alternate activities or to take a water break can be really, really important. If you are doing the same thing, using the same repetitive motions, using the same hands or feet motions, then that can be what really gets you and starts to become potentially injurious to you. And so alternating your activities, and then also alternating your standing stance. So if you were digging a little bit with, one side, you need to alternate and switch it to the other side. If you're doing some, leaf raking with your, right hand and foot dominant, then switch it over to your left hand and foot dominant and switch it up a little bit. And as you are probably well aware and have probably unfortunately experienced, the heat can kill us. And that's probably our number one danger right now, is just staying out too long, not drinking enough water, and, not realizing all the things that can make us more susceptible to heat illnesses and injuries. So, even things like me taking an allergy medication, which makes me less thirsty, can be detrimental to my health and potentially kill me out in the garden when I am in the heat. And paying attention to the heat index. And, if the heat index is like 100 degrees or more, then you're in danger. You better take it easy out there. Work early in the morning and go in the air conditioning in the afternoon. Stretching can really help us. If we go out to the garden and we've got some stiff joints and we haven't loosened up first, then we're going to be more susceptible to injury. So really stretching before, and just importantly, stretching after gardening, and just doing some basic movements to prevent us from, all of our joints from locking up on us and all of our tendons from being super tight, then that can really save us some injuries. So some tips for reducing strain on hands and wrists and arms is to, first of all, make sure that whatever tool you're using is the right size for your hand. A lot of tools are sized for giant men, I've noticed, and they do not fit my girly hands. And so making sure that you have the right sized grips is really, really important, especially for things like pruners. And trying to keep your wrist straight and potentially using adaptive tools and handles to allow you to do this. So here are just a couple of examples shown that help you keep a straighter wrist, give you a little more leverage and grip power without having to twist your wrist at odd angles to hang on to the handles. And to reduce back strain, if you are using, if you're doing any cultivating or raking or hoeing, using a long handled tool is going to help you a lot. And unfortunately, the majority of tools out there are just by standard much shorter. And so finding a longer handled tool might be a bit of a challenge, but they are out there. Fiskars has some long-handled tools, and a lot of specialty online garden shops online have some. And using a push-pull motion, so this would go for raking and hoeing and cultivating rather than a chopping motion, is going to help reduce the strain on your back. And you'll notice, like, keeping a more wide stance, as shown in the picture here, is going to help you as well. And what you're going to do is actually, you're rocking back and forth on your knees. And so you're bending your knees and you're not bending your back. You're keeping your back straight and you're just moving slightly with your knees. And this might sound like it would be a more intensive movement, but I would encourage you to give it a try, because I think you'll find that it's a lot easier to keep your balance and it's a lot easier on your back. If you have to dig, use digging tools that have a wide foot support on them. And again, you might have to look a little bit harder, but I do have a couple on my tool list. Keep your digging shovel sharp if you're actually digging in ground that has any resistance. And again, use a wider stance and a straight back when you're lifting. So the picture on the right there is just demonstrating there's not stooping over. They're using a straight back when they're lifting the dirt. And then when you go to dump that dirt, you're actually going to pivot with your legs. So you're going to take a small step to the left or right to dump that into wherever it's going, and you're not twisting with your back. So making these small changes in how we move can drastically reduce the stress that we're putting on our bodies. And using a four-wheeled cart, sometimes three-wheeled carts can be pretty stable as well, but not using a wheelbarrow where you have to actually lift and balance. Those can be incredibly unstable and difficult to maneuver because oftentimes they're overloaded. So, I would urge you to think beyond a wheelbarrow for carrying things around. And this will also, having a little garden cart around will also, reduce the amount of stuff that you're having to carry around and hopefully reduce some load there. And let's see, I want to go back to that one. So a lot of the garden carts, like the one on the top right side, actually have little dump carts. And so you can pick that up and dump it just like you would a wheelbarrow. Gardening with visual impairments can introduce some more challenges, but there are some things that you can use, tips and tools. And so, keeping tools together and easier to move rather than having to, fumble around to find things. And if you're using something like a raised bed, using a tactile grid on that bed so that you can feel where you are is going to help. And, things like having a small weatherproof radio on in a particular location while you're working so that you can orient yourself a little easier. And a lot of times, these tasks will be done with another person to assist and guide. And some other things for low vision or anybody at all is using kind of a row making tool. And this can be done yourself, or you can use, just a yardstick or a piece of PVC pipe. You can use a lot of different things. I like to use the ones with the notches. I use this to get even seating, especially when I'm working with kids. I'll mark on there with a marker or use an actual ruler or yardstick so that they can see how far apart 6 inches is, how far apart 12 inches is, so they can seat appropriately, and it helps you track where you're doing it and keep a straight row. And then there are also, commercially available ones like the spacing ruler from Gardener's Supply that's shown there. And of course, your walking surfaces should be even and prevent trip hazards and, not leaving hoses out and things like that, of course. And using plants that have some sensory element to them, that smell good, that, can be tasted. And of course, that needs to be clearly communicated or shown as to what things could be tasted. And, things like fuzzy plants or smooth plants that give some tactile interest. And just so you're aware, the colors yellow and white and blue are easier to see. So, you may pick pots that are these colors or put some tape on the handles of tools to show, a little bit easier if someone has lower vision, just to make them easier to see. And you can use rope as a guide to various garden areas or, to guard people to the safe areas. Having the right gardening gear is incredibly important too, because even if you've got the right tools and you're using the right movements, if you are dressed wrong, then you're still susceptible to all kinds of injury. I frequently hear gardeners say things like, "Oh, a little dirt never hurt anybody," and you'll see them send kids out there barefoot, and sometimes gardeners will go out barefoot or without proper gear on. And I would just like to let you know that with a degree in pest management, we had to look at lots of really gross pictures and videos and descriptions of all of the things that live in the soil that are communicable to humans. So there are all sort of pathogens out there that are fungi and bacterial and parasites and protozoas. So, don't assume that it is okay to go outside barefoot, because besides the, potential for injury from cuts and scrapes, there are actual things in the soil that you do not want getting into your skin and wounds. And so we're going to kind of break down the different gear that can be really helpful. So hats are critical, especially for those of us that are a little pale and prone to all kinds of skin ailments. So having light colored hats, wide brim, something that shades your neck. Regular ball caps are only somewhat useful. They don't shade your ears, which are really susceptible to sun damage, and they don't shade the back of your neck. So I would encourage you, for any gardener that spends any amount of time out in the Florida sun, to get a good hat, and preferably something that has a little breathability and is washable. Eye protection is absolutely critical. So of course, having something with some UV sun protection is really helpful, but wearing safety glasses and wearing the right kind of safety glasses is incredibly important. Anytime you are doing any pruning or weed eating or working around, shrubs and shrub beds, like, you are in an eye poker outer zone, and you should be wearing appropriate protection. Your eyeglasses are not protection enough. So please don't think that you have good eye protection if you're wearing eyeglasses. That's not going to protect you from much. And if you're working with any sort of pruning activities or mulch, you should be wearing sealed safety glasses. These sound horrible because it's Florida and we sweat a lot here, but you can use the ones that are anti-fog. You can use some that are a little bit more breathable, but it's super, super important. The number one way people injure their eyes is actually simply by getting particles of sawdust into them. And so anytime you're doing any pruning at all, have some sort of sealed safety glasses on. Clothing should provide protection from the sun, protection from insects, and protection from scratches and scrapes. It should be quick drying, because in Florida, you're going to sweat all of the time. And it should be able to move with your body. And so, in my opinion, things like blue jeans and flannel shirts are like the worst possible thing that you could wear in the garden. Having appropriate gloves that shouldn't constrict your movement or circulation, and they should also provide from scrapes and insects. So this is probably the top thing that I see a lot of gardeners go without, because they don't like to feel constricted. And the problem is, you haven't found the right gloves for your hands, and you need to keep looking. So the gloves pictured on the right are one example that, to do some low impact weeding and things like that, the Foxglove brand has really good gloves that fit your hand perfectly. Now, of course, you couldn't be working with lots of stones or thorns or anything. They're not going to give you appropriate protection. But for light, weeding and working in the garden, these give great protection, and they're much more durable than they would seem. Shoes
Jessica, we're
that you
getting
wear in the
close to
garden
2.
should provide insect protection and good soles if you're digging, and good arch support, good traction. A lot of our how to say this, like the garden, type of rain boots that we get at the farm stores and things like that are just awful. They don't last very long. They make your feet really hot inside of them. And so, getting more like the higher grade boots that are like white to where they're not as hot and they still protect your feet. This would be like if you're doing things like, mowing or working around pesticides and the grass is wet and things like that. And, otherwise, like, please stay out of the flip flops and the clogs. Those are dangerous. You literally are going to flip flop yourself onto the ground. The ants can get in them. You can stub your toe. You can still get scrapes and cuts and scratches. So just skip those. And please be aware of some ways to protect yourself from infection. So, especially in vegetable gardens, try to keep pets and animals out the very best you can, because having things like chickens and dogs and cats up in your vegetable garden means that they're probably pooing there, and that carries a lot of pathogens. And so, that becomes particularly risky when you're thinking of things like carrots and beets and underground vegetables where all of those pathogens have washed into the soil. And, of course, wash your produce before eating it because you can't control where the little birdies poo. And don't use water from rain barrels on your vegetables. I will get a lot of pushback on this from certain individuals, but I'm telling you now, there's no way to keep that water clean enough to use on your edible products. Use the rain barrel water on your ornamental plants. And of course, wear the right gear. So, in summary, keep gardening fun and safe. Look at how you might be able to adapt your landscape and your gardening areas for easier maintenance, and really make good use of raised beds and containers for things like vegetables and annual flowers and even some of your, long-term things. I grow a lot of herbs and perennial flowering plants in pots, and that makes my life a lot easier rather than having to plant it in beds. Stretch before and after gardening, and use the appropriate tools and movements to prevent injury and make gardening easier. And of course, wear the right gear to protect yourself from the sun and from insects and from scrapes. And as a side note, I did want to introduce this other organization that I work with that has some affiliation with our UF Horticultural Therapy program. It's the Florida Horticulture for Health Network. We offer free online webinars and online networking forums on various topics and have a lot of resources on gardening for human health. So we have a web page, a Facebook page, a YouTube video page, and you can contact us at this email. And at this point, how are we doing on time, Miss Wendy?
Well, pretty good. It's 2:02 and we've
We
got
are at time.
it's okay. It's okay. Some really great questions came in. Um, and I think you have addressed a lot of them. But one is about using cardboard to prevent weeds. So cardboard under the mulch. What are your thoughts on that?
It tends to be pretty messy and pretty temporary. And while it will work, sometimes even cardboard becomes slippery. And so it's not a long-term solution. Sometimes it can work to kind of suppress or keep weeds down during a summer period or something like that, and prevent some weeds from growing temporarily. But that's what I would use it for if you decide to
Okay.
utilize cardboard rather than like using it for walkways and things like that.
Right, right, right. How do you feel about the raised keyhole garden with the mulch in the middle over time?
Um, Anytime you're throwing a lot of mulch into a growing area, it can really rob the plants of nitrogen, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So,
I think the keyhole is it's raised beds and then the mulch is in the middle.
oh, gotcha.
I
That
think so.
can work.
Okay.
That can work. There will be some weed maintenance, with the mulch area.
It's not, there's no such thing as no maintenance, is there?
Yeah, yeah.
So Vicky has a really great comment, and I want you to comment on it, Jessica. So about 2 years, she went through 2 years of periodic hip pain associated with carrying and walking with heavy plant pots, each
Hmm.
time suffering around 2 weeks following the carrying, usually around the plant sale. In May, due to what was diagnosed as osteoarthritis in my hip, she got a new hip. But she noticed that a lot of master gardeners carry these big old heavy pots around. And what would you say about that?
Oh, wow. That it shouldn't be happening. I worked with a group that did a lot of plant giveaways for a number of years. And at the end of it all, they really ended up downsizing on the actual plants that they sold and focusing on 1 gallon pots because trying to do things that were larger were not feasible and could end up being dangerous. So there's one tip. Um, and probably enlisting some additional help and carrying them on wagons and movable carts would be critical for not having to move them around.
Find your favorite cart and get a friend, and then just really think about why we're doing it. She also mentioned wheelbarrows and carts and but then you got to get the plant up into the wheelbarrow.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Large things, are not going to make sense in it, whether it's in a landscape or whether you're doing it, in a temporary basis and moving things around for a plant sale or something.
and then Jean mentioned that she really likes the ratchet hand tool. And then Sheila wants to know about, she's making her case for the mini chainsaws, and I'm with her. I have one. I'm really careful. I wear my safety goggles. Can I keep it?
They're much safer than like the giant kind. They still can pose some danger with kickbacks, so be sure that you're familiar with that and you know how to use them appropriately so that you're not, hitting that danger quadrant.
Yes.
But, chainsaws, in my opinion, should be used when you're cutting a tree down and that
Not
tree
for
is not
fun.
too big.
Yeah.
Like if it requires a chainsaw, we're getting to the point where we probably need to ask for some help anyway, because if it's overhead stuff and it's very large branches, like that is simply not going to be safe without an appropriate tree crew and all the right equipment. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
really think about the jobs that you're taking on and whether you should be taking those jobs on.
And I like the idea of a buddy system because sometimes if I'm by myself, I'm taking chances that I wouldn't do in front of somebody else. So
Yep. Yep.
it's a good idea. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts about expandable hoses?
So I tend to not be a fan of them because I've bought every brand that I can find and all of them have popped on me. And that actually, can pose some danger in some cases, but mostly it's just annoying and unreliable. So
Yes,
if you
yes.
find one, please let me know if you've used it like for longer than 3 months and it's still working for you, because all of them that I've had have not been good quality, even when I've paid a lot of money for them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. You did mention rocking on your knees. What if your knees are the problem?
If your knees are the problem, then you probably shouldn't be try it, like see how it feels for you, because you might find that it's a lot less strain than even just standing upright. Having that wider stance and just slightly, moving your knees. But,
And the little stool that you can sit on, I saw you had those.
yeah, potentially. But, again, like let's evaluate the tasks that we're doing and does it make sense? Is there a way to eliminate this task altogether, and change up the garden or, pass this task off to somebody else? If it's truly not something that can be done, without causing yourself pain.
Okay, great. Um, So Marcia says that she loves the Farmers Defense sleeves, which I agree with, and they need to be a
Mm-hmm,
sponsor
mm-hmm,
of our conference. And Janice says she loves the Slogger shoes also. So
mm-hmm.
those are
Good
good
to
for
know.
getting wet.
Appreciate that.
And then Janice Johnson, in serious drought conditions where water is restricted for use, is there anything you can add to the water, rain barrels, in the rain barrels to use on vegetables and fruit trees?
I just wouldn't. I just wouldn't because if you're adding like the amount of like chlorine you need to, then it may not be good for your plants. And
You know, some of our plants are very sensitive to chlorine, so we have to be really careful.
yeah, and the thing about even with water restrictions is you can usually water with a hose and you can usually water with a micro irrigation system because they don't fall under those same restrictions because you're using your micro irrigation system with your potable water, on your house faucet. And so you can hook those up and they're very efficient and you can utilize them, when you can't utilize your, reclaimed water system and your larger irrigation system.
Okay. Um, and let's see, what do you think about the no dig method of gardening?
It goes back to my previous comment that was misdirected at first, and that like when you have, if that's the one that utilizes like the leaves and the mulch, then it's going to rob your garden of nitrogen for like 2 years before it turns into, the good compost that you want it to be, if I'm understanding the method that you're referring to.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, sometimes I feel like these methods that we read about in gardening magazines apply in different, much colder climates, plant
Yes.
climates that have a real true 4 seasons,
Yes.
and that may not just be the case for us here in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and someone's talking about what do you think about using pressure treated lumber for raised beds? Well, if you're a master gardener, you know we don't do that, but I'll let Jessica tell you that too.
Yep, same. I just don't recommend it. Like they're, whatever stuff they used 25 years ago, they said it was safe then, and now they've discovered it isn't so safe. And like it's preserved with some pretty intense stuff. So, I wouldn't recommend it for edibles for sure. And I don't recommend wood in contact with any soil because it just rots so fast. So, like here, it's not a sustainable option, it's a very disposable option.
You know, Jessica, I think that 20 years ago, when you and I were getting started in extension, the wood was one of the options we went to because it was so available and the other materials weren't. And now so many of these raised beds are you can get them online, you can go to the nurseries and get them. So there's a lot more
Yes.
availability of raised bed materials out there.
Absolutely. And if you're using something like a decking material or something like that and making your own raised bed, just be sure that it's approved for use with edibles because they're made from all kinds of composite materials and some, will specifically tell you that it is and others, will tell you it isn't. So
Oh, geez. Okay. Well, okay, I'm going to say this one and then we'll come back. Gina Jones says, just a comment, the battery pruner it can be, you know, can be a safety hazard. Her neighbor cut their finger off. So,
oh, have mercy.
okay. But now we're going to go on to a nice question. Um, so someone bought the pot lifter that helps us carry pots and that it's so much easier and they'd love it. Does, it's great even with the big pots. And someone also said, where did you get the golf club bag on wheels, or what is that thing called?
Yeah, that one is from Gardener's Supply, and it's
Gardener
just like
Supply.
it's
Okay.
a rolling bucket. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Rita in Seminole, she's got an indoor and an outdoor hand truck that moves the large pots.
Mhm.
And that's
Mhm.
what we use here at the headquarters of the Master Gardeners and the Florida Friendly program.
Yes, yes. And those are
And
very useful. There's still, is an element of lifting though, just getting it, onto like you've got to lift up the edge and shove it around. And So again, like think about, do we need to have things this big?
Right. Right. What have I signed up for with this giant plant? Right. Um, Vera, and this is a good question. Vera's asking for a breaker bar for for short people. So she's in Miami-Dade County, and they basically have, 2 inches maybe of topsoil, probably less, and then it goes into the coral rock down there. And
Mhm.
you have to, it's almost impossible. So Vera, I think an auger, it helps. But do you know of a breaker bar, Jessica?
No, and that's just going to be a very laborious task digging through that type of material. And I guess like my bigger question would be, what
What are we
can
doing?
you plant smaller plants that can grow into, some things? And should you be planting in those areas, like if it's that difficult?
And Vera, I grew up down there, and basically composting becomes a 365 days, 24/7 process. So my thought would be to begin building your soil on top of that rock so you can begin to get some depth in order to which plant your plants. That's what we had to do. Um, and Patricia Anderson says if you leave those expandable hoses out in the sun, they will not last, but if you bring them in the shade, she's been using one for 3 years. So
Okay.
that's been helping. And let's see, can you please leave the Q&A on the recording that would be available? Okay, Becky, leave the Q&A on this one. They are interested in that. And I think we are to the end of the questions. If you guys have any questions that you didn't get answered, feel free to email Jessica at sullivan@ufl.edu. The PDF of the presentation will be linked with the recording. And I encourage you to share this information, use it personally, but think about how you can share it. This is a nice program to be able to share out in the public. And Jessica will tell you that when you arrive at the library or a meeting hall with a bunch of tools that you can talk about, people will really come alive. Jessica, have you found that to be the case?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the in-person version is way more fun because I let people try things out and you can do a lot of show and tell, and we'll do some stretches together. And so we have had master gardeners that have given, similar versions of this program, in the community, and it's always very popular.
Very good. All right, Jessica, thank you so much for staying over with us,
Yeah,
and hopefully I'll get to see you soon. Take care, everybody.
and you.
Bye-bye.